Welcome, one and all, to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Manhattan. I'm Pastor Isabel Call, and it is such a joy to serve as the minister here. Our vision is to be a vibrant, inclusive congregation, widely known as a safe haven and force for social justice. We welcome newcomers and visitors. Don't see any in the sanctuary, but if you're online, welcome, and I hope you'll talk with Dick Beeman, our Zoom host, after the service, or anyone else. Our greeter Shirley is here in the sanctuary, especially available to answer questions. And I'll just offer an invitation to those of you in the sanctuary. If you have a joy or a sorrow you'd like to share later in the service, you can start writing it down now. We'll take a moment here as we're getting going to acknowledge the Native nations who belong to this land, including the Kanza, who were removed from here, those who came, who were removed to here from as far away as the Delaware, those who settled here, including the Osage and the Pawnee, and those who continue to call this area home, the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. Our reading today is by the Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams. It is from 1975, and I invite members of the installation task force forward to read it. We have Christy and Linda on Zoom, and Emily and Lauren here in person.
Is it on? Okay.
Give us just a minute and we'll put Linda up on the Zoom as well here.
Good morning. Sounds like it's going here.
Yes.
I call that church free, which enters into covenant with the ground of freedom, that sustaining, judging, transforming power, not made with hands. It protests against the idolatry of any human claim to absolute truth or authority. This covenant is the charter and joy of worship in the beauty of holiness.
I call that church free, which enters, I was reading the wrong line. I call that church free, which in covenant with that divine community forming power brings the individual, even the unacceptable, into a caring, trusting fellowship that protects and nourishes their integrity and spiritual freedom. It protests against the infringement of autonomy or participation, whether it be in the church, the state, the family, the daily work, or the lack of it, or in other social spheres.
I call that church free, which promotes the continuing reformation of its own and other institutions. It protests against routine conformity or thoughtless nonconformity that lead to deformity of mind and heart and community.
I call that church free, which in charity promotes freedom in fellowship, seeking unity in diversity. This unity is a potential gift sought through devotion to the transforming power of creative interchange in generous dialogue, but it will remain unity in diversity.
I call that church free, which responds in responsibility to spirit that bloweth where it listeth. The tide of the Spirit finds utterance ever and again through a minority. It invites and engenders liberation from repression and exploitation, whether of nation or economic system, of race or sex or class. It bursts through rigid, cramping inheritance, giving rise to new language, to new forms of cooperation, to new and broader fellowship.
I call that church free, which is not bound to the present, which cowers not before the vaunted spirit of the times. It earns and creates a tradition binding together past, present, and future in a living tether, in a continuing covenant and identity, bringing forth treasures, both new and old.
I call that church free, which is not imprisoned in itself or in a sect. In loyalty to its own historic character and norms, it is open to insight and conscience from every source. The church that would be free yearns to belong to the church universal, Catholic, and invisible.
But the church is never wholly free. It tolerates injustice, special privilege, and indifference to suffering, thus breaking the covenant. In the midst of this unfreedom, the congregation comes together to adore that which is holy, to confess its own brokenness, and to renew the covenant.
I call that church free, which does not cringe in despair, but casting off fear is lured by the divine persuasion to respond in hope to the light that is shown and that still shines in the darkness.
Thank you all. So my topic today is the future of religion. Small topic. But I want to start out with a comment about the future of spirituality. I'm confident that if there is a future for humanity, then there is also a future for spirituality, though it may not always have that word. I know that we are always going to need practices for listening deeply to each other and reality. I believe that as we do that listening, we will always hear deep, wordless truths about how we are all interdependent. Religion is a different matter. If you were to take a random sample of Americans at this time, probably about half would say they aren't religious. A slight majority of those would identify as spiritual, but not religious. Among the non-religious, both spiritual and not, there are many anti-religious folks who claim that organized religion is harmful and they want no part of it. And many of them are survivors of religious trauma. Linda Mercadante is a scholar of religion and emeritus professor at a divinity school, and I learned about her through a colleague of mine who teaches with her. Mercadante is interested in the spiritual but not religious, this group of people. Now, among her colleagues and serious religious people, the spiritual but not religious are sometimes stereotyped as, quote, poachers or wannabes who are drawn to the exotic, the mystical, or to them foreign, stealing bits and pieces of spiritual traditions and practices for their own use. But, Mercadante says, that's not usually how the spiritual but not religious see themselves. Many see their contemporary approach to spirituality as open-minded, tolerant, peacemaking, and often, in fact, a loftier feat than affiliating with any particular religion. They embody a trend in society, not simply to move away from religion, but to find some way to blend, combine, merge, or transcend organized religion. So you might think these folks sound a lot like us. But according to Mercadante, the spiritual but not religious ethos is biased against long-term identification or commitment. She says, the spiritual but not religious move the locus of authority from outside to inside themselves. In contrast, I'm confident in calling Unitarian Universalism a religion because our religious community is the locus of at least some authority on spiritual matters. But we do have a lot in common. We have a lot of friends who are spiritual but not religious, and many of us found Unitarian Universalism via being spiritual and unaffiliated. In this historical moment, not only is there a decline in organized religion and an explosion of non-religious spiritual seeking, we've also seen an expansion of justice work that is being led by largely secular groups. And they're struggling, not just because the poor and marginalized are under attack by our extractive economy and corrupt politics. Nonprofit professionals, grassroots activists, and dedicated activists on the front lines are noticing and talking about toxicity in the internal workings of their organizations. Many are becoming cynical and quitting despite the surge of humanitarian crises around the world that need well-led responses. It is a time of burnout. Maurice Mitchell, the national director of the Working Families Party, has put out an influential analysis and pep talk for those involved in secular organizing. He says that resilient organizations must ask themselves and answer the following questions. They're structural questions. What are we? Ideological questions. Where are we going? Strategic questions. How do we get there? And emotional questions. How do we behave on the journey? These questions remind me of the song we sang earlier. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? But Mitchell didn't include one of those questions. He didn't ask, where do we come from? This question is rarely asked by secular organizations, and perhaps this is one of the problems. The Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams wrote, "We of the Free Church tradition should never forget or permit our contemporaries to forget that the decisive resistance to authoritarianism and the beginning of modern democracy began in the church." The churches of the left wing of the Protestant Reformation demanded that every member under the power of the Spirit would have the privilege and the responsibility of interpreting the gospel and also of assisting to determine the policy of the church. This left-wing movement, he said, wrought a great social revolution via a doctrine of the Spirit. Once released, the new Spirit poured forth into all areas of society. It could not be kept within the bounds of church life. Adams could see this Spirit born in the free church, alive in governance, family, schools, and all voluntary associations. Voluntary associations, that was his big term. He was a theologian of voluntary associations. These are the organizations that work for social reform, the protection of civil rights, the protection or extension of voting rights, the maintenance of professional standards, and the promotion of new legislation. Cooperatives and modern trade unions are also voluntary associations. And the idea of this, he says, in this country, it was born in the free church movement, which was born in the Protestant Reformation. Through voluntary associations, modern society moved the locus of authority from church patriarchs to distributed shared leadership, responsible or responsive to those most affected by the decisions. Voluntary associations are effective at organizing people to redistribute societal resources of time and money and attention. But when this redistribution increases equity, those used to enjoying unearned privilege are threatened and they lash out. Maurice Mitchell points out that over the past century, there has been, quote, a one-sided, often government-initiated effort to defang movements for justice. Leaders have been jailed, killed, or co-opted. Organizations have been invaded, dismantled, or neutralized. Justice-oriented organizations have inherited this traumatic and often bloody legacy. End quote. Many of the leaders lost were religious leaders. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Oscar Romero. Not only did their loss compromise progress toward their visions, it had a chilling effect on other religious leaders and religious people in general. Perhaps this is part of what disillusioned the formerly religious. Without prophetic fire, religion is hypocritical, and people can smell that. Many of our would-be religious companions have retreated into their hearts and their heads, investing in spirituality as a leisure activity rather than a vocation, something that they do in community daily. It's a way of life. Some invested in secular justice work. That became their vocation. But this segmentation of spirit from justice is not resilient. So it's not surprising that in addition to the decline in religion, other voluntary associations are struggling. So in this context of decline, the increase in the spiritual but not religious is a sign of life. We shouldn't participate in scholars' bashing of the spiritual but not religious or fault them for not joining us. They are a part of larger patterns of reorganization. It may interest you to know that there are increasing numbers of spiritual but not religious people who are going to divinity school. They don't intend to become clergy. They often don't get lured in to religious communities and become clergy. A colleague who teaches at a Methodist seminary says more and more are coming in. They don't have vocational goals, even though it's a vocational program. They're investing their savings or going into debt to do this. Meanwhile, many Unitarian Universalists who go to seminary are doing the same thing. Instead of becoming Unitarian Universalist congregational ministers, they find other ways to live their life and use everything they gained. They go into chaplaincy or they start another career altogether, unaffiliated with this religion. Now, this isn't because there aren't jobs. Despite the decline in religious membership, there's also a clergy shortage. So these people graduating with Masters of Divinity, we have jobs for them. So my colleagues and I find this quite perplexing, and I would invite anyone's insight. What is going on? I will admit that I don't have a prediction about the global state of religion in the future, whenever that starts. But I do have a vision for how Unitarian Universalism is a powerful force for good in that future. And I think it is how we relate to different segments of the population. So for the spiritual but not religious, Unitarian Universalists can help them become more organized, more accountable, and more effective at sharing their gifts with all of humanity. Linda Mercadante has found that the spiritual but not religious seek ancient wisdom, but they are prone to accepting at face value what is said by charismatic teachers and authors, which leaves them vulnerable to manipulation or half-baked ideas. They're also inclined to appropriate practices of religious and spiritual traditions without authentic relationship. So this can be respectful, inaccurate, and therefore harmful. In UU community, at our best, we're not immune from doing those things, but at our best, we check our sources and build accountable partnerships and collaborations with other spiritual communities. We also seek ways for the serenity that we cultivate inside ourselves to be realized in the external world by everybody, not just people who can afford meditation retreats. For the not religious who are engaged in social action, Unitarian Universalists can offer them settings to share the deep grief and profound joy that often gets set aside in the hustle of nonprofit work or activism. We can also anchor them to a spiritual lineage and a history of people facing challenges, resisting authoritarianism, and persevering, including the first Christians and the fiery thinkers of the Radical Reformation. These are particular areas of interest or people of interest of our theologian James Luther Adams, but he was also, in his time, in deep relationship with religious leaders who were fighting the good fight. In particular, German religious leaders who were resisting Nazism. So this week I watched a video of James Luther Adams in conversation with various religious leaders in Germany in the 20s and 30s. He learned from what they were doing, from the people who stuck to principles and helped save lives. So our theologians' theology of voluntary association was honed in that reflection about what can work and how can religion support us. For folks not engaged in social action because they've burned out or they're intimidated, I think we have a prophetic message as Unitarian Universalists. We can inspire people to engage. We can inspire them that this world is worth our efforts to save. We've got to show them that we're religious, but we're not sheep. We're effective and we love life. We can make this work irresistible. And then there are the religious who are working at cross purposes to what we understand to be the sacred intent for humanity. Those using the old religious tools of domination and abuse. UUs can and should be giving them a run for their money. We can be ready to talk confidently about God, idolatry, heaven and hell on earth. We need to build our religious muscles so that when they're picking on the weak and vulnerable, we can say, hey, pick on someone your own size. How do we get to this future? And how should we behave on the journey? We're going to have to listen to members of each segment of the population. We have to build relationships with them, truly understand them. I just gave a list of things that we can offer other people. But it's a relationship, it's an exchange, and we will be changed as we relate authentically with other groups. I think it starts, and why I have invested in governance structure and our institution here at UUFM, I think it starts with ourselves and with each other. How do we relate to each other? Knowing what we are in relationship to each other. But and making commitments and breaking them again, and then learning how to renew our commitments with each other. And from there, we open our attention and our hearts to others. But it's not just listening to them, it's also listening with them to the world as it is now in all its imperfection. And that, I think, is a spiritual and religious endeavor. So I want to give Arundhati Roy the last word. She says, another world is not only possible, she's on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. So the future of religion, it was a big topic. I wonder if you all have any questions about what I said, either for me to attempt to answer right now, or that we could explore together today or in the future. There's been a significant amount of interest in doing a class together on Unitarian Universalist history. So I'm excited about that. And there may be other interest, other questions. What is the future of religion? Our closing words again, Arundhati Roy. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. So let us go forth and listen.